Have you ever exported a route from your favorite outdoor mapping app and wondered, what do all these file format options actually mean? What are the differences? Is there a difference between a route and a track? In this video, I'm going to explain it all and help you crack the code. The goal of this video is for you to learn 1, what all the outdoor activity related GPS file formats are, 2, what makes each one different and which ones are basically the same. A big question is, when will you get turn notifications with street names? And also, how do you get points of interest onto the map? 3, it'll help you determine when you should use which file format. And 4, what I think is the best file format personally. We're going to cover GPX first and then go over the fundamentals of routes, tracks, and waypoints. I actually first got interested in this topic of GPS file formats when I was on a group ride and I had mentioned to some guy that I had the route for the ride loaded on my Garmin head unit. He replied with a, well, actually, you have a track loaded. We then proceeded to never talk again. Then I will cover FIT and TCX, which are other file formats that can be used to contain GPS-related data. KML and CSV are other options available within the Ride with GPS export options, but I will actually cover those in a separate future video because otherwise this video would be way too long. During this process, I'll also show some of the computer code that lies within these file formats. We will dissect the contents of the files this way to further illustrate the differences of how the data is used and stored. You don't need to understand any computer science at all to follow along. I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. I actually tested all of the file formats on my GPS Garmin head unit on my bike, and the results were super interesting. I hope you're still tracking along and keeping on course. Now let's get root into it. Just a real quick primer on what file formats are, in case you don't know what I'm talking about. I'm referring to the .insert file format that you will see on all of your downloads and your files on your computer. You surely have come across a doc for a Word document or an XLS for an Excel file. Just like those, GPS data has its own set of various file formats when you save these files. You will see GPX, KML, .fit, .tcx, and so on and so forth. So first we have GPX. GPX stands for GPS Exchange Format. At its very core, a GPX file will contain a set of latitude and longitude coordinates that describe the journey the user plans to go on or has already been on and recorded with a GPS device, like a cycling head unit or running watch. It is also what is known as a vector file format, which is more relevant from an overall GIS or geographic information systems lens, which I won't even bother getting into for this video. The GPX file was created in 2002 and is the forefather of the Garmin FIT file that is quite often used today by most people and devices. The GPX file can consist of latitude and longitude data points in the form of routes, tracks, and or waypoints. I will break down all 3 of these data point types because they are fundamental building blocks for the file. Let's start with the most simple data point, which in my opinion is the waypoint. A waypoint is a single point on a map, again with a single latitude and longitudinal position. It is also commonly referred to as a point of interest or POI. The use case for waypoints is often to enrich your file's data with reference point information that is useful to a human. In this case, a hiker, runner, or cyclist. Typically, they would have a symbol. So for example, a water symbol, like we see here, and then a name like tap water, for example, which might help you know that you can get clean water out of here. Here's a quick demo on my Garmin head unit. Here we can see these little points of interest. These are what I'm talking about here, but they could be a waypoint or a course point. I will explain that more in a little bit. GPX waypoints are super useful for enriching a GPX file with more useful information than just a colored line. In this way, they're typically more of an enhancement to the file. A very simple comparison to think about is actually a treasure map from when you were a kid maybe. The treasure map probably doesn't really show names of roads and trails as much. It just says go from here to here to here, and then hopefully you'll find the treasure. However, doing sports in the backcountry is often a bit more complicated than a treasure map because you have mountains and water bodies you want to maneuver. So more precise data like when to make turns, which direction and which roads to follow are critical, and that is where the GPX concept of routes comes in. Note that the nuances of when a waypoint is actually displayed within a GPX file's code depends on two things: how you go about building the file and in which program you export it from. As we progress through the explanation, I will elaborate on both of these. Next, we have routes, which at the very minimum can be thought of as two or more waypoints. So a simple example would be point A is Vancouver and point B is Calgary. We've all been through this experience in Google Maps, looking for directions from one spot to the other. Google Maps takes your point A and point B routes and uses its own data engine to calculate the best path to follow. And subsequently, behind the scenes, it'll generate a subset of latitude and longitude points that show all the places to follow and where to turn. You can see here that there's two options to get from Kelowna to Kamloops, and Google Maps calculated this for us. This series of little points to follow are called route points now instead of waypoints. Sometimes the term cue sheet entry is used to describe route points, which made me think of a super practical example from the 2000s, maybe the early 2000s, called MapQuest. So I used to print off directions from MapQuest to help my parents drive me to soccer games when I was a kid. And what the output actually is a cue sheet, which are also simply route points. You can see that MapQuest service is probably a bit obsolete now since Google Maps has come along, and that's why they're running web ads now, I think. But here you can see the cue sheet entries here on the left side. Speaking of Google Maps, interestingly enough, there is a way to take your Google Maps route, run it through a third-party app, and export it into a GPX route file. However, most people just run the app on their phone and follow it that way, so it isn't really necessary for 99% of us to do that. So you might have done the same route building process in an outdoor activity app like Garmin Connect or Ride with GPS 2, which I have open here. The process is simply drop a point like this, and then you can drop a point over here, and Ride with GPS calculated a route for us. But typically people will use these apps to either A, download an existing track that somebody made already, or build their own track. Yes, I said track, not route. I'll actually get into tracks in just one more second, but the key point with routes is that you are simply telling the software application that you want to go from point A to point B to point C, and you are enabling said software system to calculate the path of trails and roads to take you there. Tracks can be thought of as a series of tight and frequent latitude and longitude points called track points that form a path from a starting point to a finishing point. This can also be thought of as breadcrumbs. However, I'm gluten-free, so I don't use that term. You might have come across a GPX track when you used a GPS to record a ride or run, and then uploaded it into an outdoor activity map. If you shared this track to the public, someone else might have downloaded it and followed it themselves. In this process, they will actually be following a track they downloaded and then creating their own new track when they actually go about following it. Are you still keeping track of what I'm saying? However, sometimes you might find yourself creating your own track manually using Gaia GPS, for example, by plotting each and every little point along the way. I built this for the entire Great Divide mountain bike route in Ride with GPS. So here's an example of a section right here. In this case, then you could choose to export this as a GPX route or a GPX track, among many other formats. Here you can see GPX Track and GPX Route. In my opinion, tracks are more useful for outdoor adventures specifically, where you know where you want to stay along a certain path or trail and or possibly avoid specific roads and trails. Whereas with a route, you might not really care which roads Google Maps routes you through, or you just use their handy feature that allows you to select different routing options for your trip, depending on distance or traffic. Again, at the end of the day, typically most GPX files that you export out of an outdoor activity app will be a track, but it is quite possible that people will refer to it as a route, because the term route is a bit more intuitive for common language. For example, Ride with GPS calls their feature a route planner, even though the majority of GPX exports will be tracks with track points and not routes with route points. A different and also somewhat confusing approach is that Garmin Connect uses the term courses. So you can export an existing course like this, or build a course with GPX data right here. But it will actually just contain track points. I actually like how Garmin calls it a course because it doesn't muddle the naming with GPX file terms. However, the term course becomes more intuitive when we get to the FIT and TCX files later in the video. The differences between routes and tracks is something that I think is quite interesting, and potentially you can someone yourself one day. I will come back to the nuance, benefits, and downsides later in the video between routes and tracks. As we saw already, Ride with GPS allows you to choose between GPX routes and GPX tracks if you want to. So just a reminder, warning again, I will refrain from overly dissecting the computer code, but the GPX file, regardless if it's a route, track, or if it has waypoints, consists of XML, aka Extensible Markup Language. Just like any spoken language where there is agreed upon standard for how to speak and write words, GPX follows XML to standardize the way the GPS data is described. XML is also readable to a human, which is cool because you can visually see the data points in comparison to some other file formats that I'll cover later. So to quickly show you GPX data in XML form, I'm going to export the exact same track from Ride with GPS, like you can see here, but one file in the form of a GPX route, clicking download, and then one file in the form of a GPX track, clicking download. By showing the exact same track, it will show the differences in XML data really clearly. You can see here that Ride with GPS gives a very brief statement about the differences and benefits of each file type. Here it says useful for any GPS unit, contains no cue sheet entries, only track information, breadcrumb trail is in brackets. And then for GPX route, only the cue sheet entries, not the entire track, not useful for most. You most likely want to use a GPX track. Again, this doesn't really describe too much, but it is better than nothing probably if you didn't know anything before. So I already clicked download, and now I'll open up the file in the default text editor of your computer, which is called Notepad, which you can see here. Oh, it's not going to show me the name here, but this little thing is called Notepad, and it looks like a notepad, and it's used for editing text, in some case computer code. So here we have a GPX XML route file. It's pretty cool. If you ever thought what was inside it, this is what it is here. So for the purpose of this video, let's just ignore all of this top stuff, and let's go down to where it says RTE, which stands for route. Then we have name here, and that's the name of the route from Ride with GPS. And then we have this very important thing here called RTEPT, which is route point. And then we have a latitude data point and a longitude data point. Then below we have a name, which in this case is start, but if you go down a few route points, you'll see that some of the names are right and some of the names are left, which are telling you the directions to go. And then we also have at the bottom these comments, which says turn left on Arrow VLG way, or here it says turn right onto Osilowski Road, which again are clearly more detailed versions of what we see in name, and they're kind of similar to cue sheet entries. So hopefully that wasn't too complicated, because to complicate things, I just want to point out that the latitude and longitude coordinates are listed here as integers, or in other words, numbers with decimals. If you recall from elementary school, we learned that latitude and longitude are described as degrees and compass directions. For example, Vancouver is approximately 49 degrees north and 123 degrees west. Basically, GPX files display the coordinates as integers so that it's easier for a computer to understand. And this whole process follows different standards that are named differently for different countries and satellite networks. I won't go more into this because that would be way too long. So basically, to summarize, the latitude and longitude coordinates are in decimals for a reason. We can see that the simple route point cluster is repeated several times through the file, but of course with different coordinates and turn commands, or cue sheet entries if you prefer that term. Then all the way at the bottom, we can see, scrolling down here, that route is ended with this little cross, and then the GPX file is ended with this little cross. That's all. This wasn't too scary, right? Now let's look at the GPX Track XML and see what it says. Again, I have it in the notepad, and we can see a few differences right away from the GPX Route XML that we saw previously. I still have it right here. It's the route one. Now we're on the track one. Of course, the tag is called a TRK or a track. That's a huge difference right away. Secondly, we can see many track points or TRKPTs, so track point, with latitude and longitude coordinates. Again, this file also has elevation data for each track point right here, which is pretty cool to see. Now the big difference here is the sheer quantity of track points versus route points that we saw previously. This can be reflected in the file size alone. So let's take a look at the file size. So here I have the GPX Track highlighted, and then this is the GPX Route that I downloaded before. So the track is approximately 100 times bigger than the route, which is kind of cool to see. Again, these are kilobytes, which are really not that big in general, but we'll come back to that in a second. Another big difference we can see is that there are no written cue sheet entries saying what direction to turn and on which street, which we do have in the GPX routes that we saw before. One thing I mentioned earlier about tracks is that you can be following a track on your GPS device and then recording a new track during the activity. Now I'm back in Garmin Connect, and let's take a quick peek at the XML from a ride I recorded already, because the GPX Track has some extra data within it that's of note, because it was an activity that I actually did. So I'm opening up this one now into Notepad again. So the biggest thing here is the time tag that we can see. And this actually shows a time. And it's the precise time of day that I was at a certain coordinate, which we can see up here. The coordinates, latitude and longitude again. This allows for the data to be produced into speed and pace readings. Also, we can see what are called extensions, which is under this extension tag. And these are additional data points that a device manufacturer can add into the file. So we can see the temperature here under the extensions at each track point, which could be cool to look at perhaps over a big mountain descent to see how the temperature changed so rapidly. Finally, let's take a look at some Waypoint XML, just to give you a taste of what the waypoint looks like within a GPX file. So if you're familiar with my channel, I sometimes rave about Ride with GPS. One downside to the platform is that being able to drop and export POIs is behind the premium version paywall. I had paid for this in the past, but right now I don't need it, so I don't pay for it. However, these POIs actually show up in the GPS XML as waypoints, which is kind of cool, and we can go take a look at them. These can be viewed within your Garmin device, on the map, and on the up ahead feature. Now the nice thing is you can actually drop and export POIs in the Garmin Connect course builder feature for free. This is a good alternative if you don't want to pay for Ride with GPS's premium version. So here's his example course I put together in Garmin Connect, and I dropped a couple of POIs to demonstrate what I'm talking about. A quick note so you don't get confused. Ride with GPS calls the waypoints POIs, and Garmin calls the waypoints course points. They're the same thing at the end of the day. When I export this file as a GPX, which I'm going to do right now, go down, download GPX file, we'll be able to see in the XML, we're accumulating a few now, we'll be able to see that these are WPTs or waypoints. And you can see that there's only two here because I only dropped 2 points. And they show the precise latitude and longitude, which I think is pretty cool. We can also see in my Garmin Edge 530 that when I loaded up the course before, it showed these waypoints on the map. But you can also see them in the course points tab, and if you scroll down in the ride mode. This is super handy if you're doing a race or a long route where you might want to plot water filtering spots, for example. Next up, we have the FIT file extension. Extension is .fit, and perhaps this option fits your needs. FIT stands for Flexible and Interoperable Data Transfer. It was created by Garmin in 2010 with the main purpose of allowing Garmin devices to capture more sport and health-related data. Whereas the GPX was originally designed primarily with the GPS navigation purpose in mind. We previously saw that the GPX files do have extensions available to store some of this health-related data, like heart rate, for example. However, Garmin identified that the growing category of health tracking wearables would benefit from a more specifically catered file type that can more purposely include sport type, lap, split, and sensor data, to name a few. So this is how the FIT file came about. Let's talk about when a FIT file can be used, and let's take a peek at the computer code of a FIT file. A FIT file can be exported out of Ride with GPS, as we can see here. It's the first option at the top. And it is also what Garmin will natively produce on most of their modern devices. Going into Garmin Connect, you can see here from a cycling route that I did previously with my Garmin Edge 530, when I click Export Original, which is here, Export Original, it provides a FIT file. And you can see that just downloaded. It's in a zip, and you can see that it's a FIT file. We will open it up in a second, I promise. For activities that you've already conducted, it seems clear that you would want the FIT file, since it can make the most sense of workout-related data. So that is why Strava, for example, prefers the FIT file from your Garmin, or even from Zwift. You can easily conceptualize that your Zwift ride is capturing a lot of activity data, like heart rate, speed, and power, so the FIT file naturally provides that data better. Additionally, my current assumption is that when you use Garmin Connect Send to Device, it is leveraging a FIT file specifically for your Garmin Edge device. We can actually see that Ride with GPS is suggesting that the FIT file is the best format to export into a Garmin Edge device. And this seems to be because A, the file sizes are smaller than TCX courses and GPX tracks. I'll compare them more directly in a bit. And B, the Garmin support website states that the FIT files record distance more accurately than a GPX, which becomes super handy when thinking about the use case of running track workouts or road running efforts. It does state that the raw position of a GPX file is more accurate than a FIT file, but I assume that it is probably negligible for most, like an inch versus a foot kind of thing, which could be simply caused by including less decimals in the actual points. Let me know in the comments if you happen to know more about this, because I'd be interested to learn. Another key point on FIT files is that they are used specifically for health and fitness apps and wearables too. So one might download a gym workout or running workout onto their Apple Watch in the form of a FIT file. The wearable can then use this data to tell the user when they reach their running distance goal or heart rate target, for example. Same as with the GPX files we talked about first, Ride with GPS won't provide the POIs, aka waypoints, in your FIT file exports unless you opt for the paid version. Again, Garmin Connect does this for free. The Ride with GPS file format summary was a bit confusing for me until I learned more about file formats, because it seemed like to me that you can only use GPX Track file formats on the paid version, of course, to get waypoint data in your Garmin device. Here it says include POI as waypoints and upgrade to premium, upgrade now. However, include POI as waypoints is technically referring to the specific WPT tag, whereas the FIT file and TCX file, which I'll get into next, don't actually represent these POIs in their files as tags named waypoints. They are actually named course points, because of course, Garmin has to use their own favorite term, which is course. It is a little nuanced that hopefully wasn't confusing for you, but it was confusing for me at first. So a big topic that is also a little bit confusing is that a modern GPS unit will have turn guidance settings, and it will natively notify you with an alert before the turn comes. It will display right arrow on Manello Gardens, for example. However, what Ride with GPS offers on their paid version is the ability to set custom notify before turn distances. For From my understanding, Garmin's default notify before turn distance is approximately 200 meters for the first audible and somewhat annoying ping, which suits most people's needs just fine. But perhaps you want it closer for some reason. Well, you can set this custom distance for FIT files and TCX files. You cannot do this for GPX files within Ride GPS though. The big point is you do not need the paid version of Ride with GPS to get turn notifications, but you do need it to set custom turn notification distances. Unless there is some Garmin Edge setting that I don't know about, if so, please tell me in the comments because it would be super useful. Now that we are computer code pros, let's finally open up this FIT file that's just been sitting here in our notepad and we'll take a look. So opening it up and we're back with all of the other files from before. The first thing that we can see is that it's in a binary code format, which means in this case that it's not legible to a human. I personally don't know what all of these question mark boxes and other symbols mean. Do you? Unfortunately, your Garmin device and any device that can read a FIT file can understand this data. One of the benefits of this binary code approach that the FIT file takes is that it can hold more data than the equivalent GPX Track, but with significantly less file size. This means that you can fit more of these FIT files on your devices if you ever wanted to. That being said, file size for a newer Garmin Edge device shouldn't really be a big issue anyways, because they can hold 16 gigabytes or more on average, and a GPX file is a small fraction of a megabyte usually. But I think Garmin is kind of future-proofing with this FIT file format, because only a few years ago, people recorded their heart rate with a stopwatch and their finger taking pulse. Now it is a very common metric to track on your devices with a chest strap or a wrist sensor. In the future, who knows what our fitness devices will track? Perhaps lactate, glucose, or even brain activity. Regardless, the more data, the larger the files will get, and the FIT file is ready to fit it all in. Another point is, of course, as you can tell, in our notepad, we cannot read this file and understand what is in it, like we did in the XML with the GPX Track and GPX Route. This is a downside for the small few of us that find it useful and interesting to read these files manually. But for the majority of us, it doesn't matter in the slightest. Finally, let's talk about all things TCX or Training Center XML. It was created by Garmin in 2007, which is 3 years before the FIT file was created. I'm covering this after the FIT file overview for two reasons. One, its purpose is very similar to the FIT file, and two, I think this format has become increasingly obsolete as most GPS devices now have internal mapping capabilities anyways. So the TCX file is similar to the GPX file for the reason I hope you might have already guessed. It is written in XML and can be read by a human. We will take a peek at the file in a second. As I discussed before, the GPX file is not purposely built for health-related data. So Garmin created the TCX to try to offer a better home for the data in the files. However, the file sizes are a lot larger than a GPX file, like I said before, and I think this is a big reason why Garmin innovated further to create the FIT file 3 years later. Another point on TCX is that the files contain cue sheet data, similar to what I spoke about with GPX routes. It contains data in the file stating turn left here and turn right here at this spot. This was actually really useful perhaps a decade ago when plenty of GPS units did not have a built-in mapping capability. So the device would display just like a left arrow and a right arrow that you would follow along. Now, of course, most modern GPS units, like the Garmin Edge 530 that I have, contain their own internally stored mapping data. So a file like a GPX Track that doesn't have the cue sheet entries in the file will still operate the same in the GPS unit and tell you when to turn and on which street name. As I mentioned earlier, the TCX files can leverage a custom notify before turn distance in the Ride with GPS paid version. Probably not a huge deal for most, and I would logically think this should just be a feature that the GPS device can calculate and configure itself internally. Note that there are some alternatives to paying for export and file types. Some converters and programs are available online that are written by free contributors and will allow you to manipulate the files how you wish. For example, you can input turn guidance notification distances using some of these tools. I personally don't bother with that level of nerdery myself, but maybe one day, and perhaps you could save a few bucks by doing this. Without further ado, let's take a peek at the TCX file. Let's click download.tcx file here. So again, this is XML, but a different format than what we see with the GPX. This is kind of like how Canadians and Scottish people speak the same language, which is English, but might have different words for the same thing or a different way of saying the same things. I can't really think of an example, but maybe you can leave one in the comments if you know one. So again, I got the TCX open here, and we can see that we have some new things like the lap tag. And this shows the start and finishing coordinates. Again, we have the latitude and longitude points plotted, which as we know are fundamental pieces of GPS data. We have track point, and within it, it shows not only the time, but the altitude meters we can see here, and the distance meters. A cool thing to compare between a TCX file of an activity that someone conducted versus a TCX file that somebody has plotted out as a course but has yet to run or ride is the time tag values will be different. Again, these are the time tags. For example, this TCX file of a random ride I did, I'm going to export it. It shows a variable amount of seconds between each track point because my speed was increasing and decreasing. So in some of it, it's about a 10-second difference, in some of it, it's less, and some of it's more. So let's scroll down and take a look at what I'm talking about. So we have time here, and that's at 54:53. And then if we go down, this one is 54:55, so that's 2 seconds after. But if we go down to the next one, we will see that it is, let's see, 4 seconds after. So the next one is 5 seconds after. So again, we can see that it's not exactly the same amount of time after each one. But in the route that I built in Ride with GPS and exported as a TCX, it shows a uniform 10 or 20 seconds between each track point. So here we have it at, let's see, the time is at 2 seconds, and then 12 seconds, and then 22 seconds here. Because obviously I have not recorded it as a ride yet, and therefore it is just defaulting it as 20 seconds or 10 seconds. This is different from a GPX Track or Route export because it doesn't even bother trying to default a time value for those formats, which would save the tiniest amount of file space, which is kind of nice. Finally, if we scroll down, we can see that the TCX file also contains course points. So scrolling all the way down, I need the help of this slider. Let's go all the way down to find the course points. And yeah, here they are. Here are course points. And these are kind of like cue sheet entries. It says point type here, which is left turn here or right turns in this case. And it also has a notes tag which spells out the turn to turn on. For example, left turn on Burrard Street, or right or turn right onto Middle Road. Again, this is cool to look at if you like to read XML files, but most modern GPS units have the internal mapping capabilities to provide this data anyways. Now, for the moment you've all been waiting for, let's compare all three of them and see what the pros and cons are. After that, I will conclude what I think the best file format is. Let me know what you think in the comments. Before we can get into it, let's do a quick comparison of file size alone. I exported the exact same Ride with GPS route as a GPX Route, GPX Track, FIT file, and TCX file. So the 4 that we've talked about in this video so far. In my downloads folder here, we can see the following. The smallest file is the GPX Route, which is at the top, as again, it just contains the cue sheet entries, which is a small amount of data similar to your old MapQuest sheets that we saw before. The next smallest file is the magical FIT file, which typically will have the most data within it as it can house a whack load of health data and sports metrics, along with the track points. Again, this is because it is a binary code file instead of XML. It is approximately 20 times the size of the GPX file. The GPX Route file, sorry, that is. Next we have the GPX Track, which is approximately 5 times larger than the FIT file. This is because it is an XML file again, that has a lot of text and characters within it, which fortunately allows us to read it plainly, but it also makes the file really big. And last but the least is the TCX file, which is approximately 4 times the size of the GPX Track file. It is a double whammy as it is XML and can also contain a lot of health data and sports metrics more easily. But, it's the biggest one on this list by far. Just to be kind of thorough, let's take a peek at some file formats from a run I did a few weeks ago being exported out of Garmin Connect. It actually follows the same sequence as we saw before, with the FIT file being the smallest at 73 kilobytes. And then let's scoot out of here, and then we can see at the top we have the GPX file and TCX file for the same activity. The numbers are the same here, so you can see. And so the GPX track is the next biggest, and then the TCX file is the largest out of the 3 of them. One takeaway is that the data for this 2-hour activity is larger than the data for the Great Divide Tour leg I just showed before, which has less data in the files because I hadn't done the ride yet, so there was not activity metrics being tracked. However, the course is 10 times longer and would take over 10 hours for me to ride at the very least. This means that the activity data that I would export from a ride like that would be quite large in relative comparison to my 2-hour 21-kilometer run that I did before. Also, this ascent was calculated totally wrong by my GPS, so just take that into account. I did not climb 3,000 meters over this run, but hopefully I did maybe burn this many calories, but also probably not. So why does file size matter? Well, it can have micro impacts in your computer's ability to load up the files quickly, and more notably, it will take up less space on your activity devices, like your smartwatch or Garmin head unit. Overall, a pretty low impact if you ask me, and not a big deal either way with the amount of storage that all of our devices naturally have. Finally, let's do some proper pros and cons. This will be partially from the perspective of wanting eloquently written and well categorized computer code, and also what actually matters to you as the general end user. So the pros of GPX tracks are that they have around a medium file size, and you can read them as plain text, or at least now you can because I showed you how. Like, comment, and subscribe. However, the cons of GPX tracks are that there are no Q-sheet data within the file, which might be a downside if you plan to read the code. Again, doesn't matter for any modern GPS device anyways. I don't really see a con on the side of following the track. They're just not as optimized for Garmin activities as the other files, but the end user won't really tell the difference when analyzing the activity after following the track, because most apps like Garmin Connect and Strava can consume the FIT file data that your recording device will naturally produce anyways. So the pros of GPX routes are that they have a very small file size and Q-sheet data sits within the file. So the big con of GPX routes is because the file doesn't contain the specific and frequent track points, it is possible that your GPS device will calculate a different way to get from point A to point B than what you viewed in your course editing software. This could cause small to large discrepancies, and for this reason is less desirable for planned off-road activities. So the pros of a FIT file are that they have a smaller file size and they can contain a lot of health-related data, which is specifically useful for importing a gym workout plan into your health wearable, and also when analyzing heart rate, speed, cadence, elevation, temperature data, and etc. from your bike ride activity. The main con of a FIT file is that the file is not legible by a human because it is binary code. This is a downside for 1% of us, and 99% of us probably don't care at all. So the pros of a TX file is that historically it's been a versatile file across a lot of older devices and non-Garmin devices. Specifically, GPS devices that don't have routable maps built in. Another pro is that it natively supports health and sport metric data. Additionally, data can be read plain text because it's XML. And finally, another pro is that Ride with GPS can offer custom notify before turn distances, even though it's behind the paywall. And the main con of a TCX, like you might have guessed, is that it has the largest file size by far from all of the other options that we talked about today. Like I said before, I ran a test where I exported the exact same course in a GPX Track, GPX Route, FIT file, and TCX file, and rode along it to see if there were any differences from a user perspective on my Garmin head unit. There is absolutely no difference. Furthermore, they all have cue sheet entries in the Turn Directions tab, which means that it doesn't even matter if your original file had cue sheet entries or not, because Garmin will calculate it for you either way. In conclusion of this long-winded video, what do I recommend? I think the FIT file is best for most course building and activity-related use cases. If you're going to do some more specific and sophisticated outdoor navigation, perhaps a GPX file works better, as you can view and possibly edit the XML yourself. In a lot of ways, to 95% of us, we will not be able to tell nor care about the difference between a GPX, FIT, and TCX file format. So rest assured, if you were missing out on some valuable data, I would tell you, and you probably would know anyways. Once you have your file on a modern GPS unit, like the Garmin Edge 530, all of these formats have street names, turn notifications, and cue sheets. I think the skill that we have learned of knowing how to interpret the code within each file format is kind of cool, because it paints the context for how the FIT file even came about and why it is generally the most useful file. Stay tuned for a future video, because I will cover KML, which is the Google Earth GPS file format, and I'll also cover CSV exports of a GPS file. The CSV data can be used within good old Microsoft Excel to build some cool charts and tables that might otherwise cost money in other apps like Strava or simply be less customizable. Thanks for hanging out. Please leave a comment, like I said 5 times before. Maybe even leave a like and slap that subscribe button. Until next time, I'm out.